Before we get started with the swatching flat in the round technique, I wanted to give you a couple of tips on swatching in general. So the first tip is to cast on at least 6 inches of stitches. So here we are right at 6 inches going across, and this is because gauge is typically measured over 4 inches. So if you only knit a 4-inch swatch, the edges might pull in, they might curl. So knitting 6 inches gives you the ability to measure your swatch in the center of your work and have your gauge be as accurate as possible. So you'll want to knit, at least a 6-inch square, both, going across and vertically. Now that we've gotten that covered, we can start showing the technique to swatch flat in the round. So here, of course, I've cast on, a much smaller piece, and this is just for demonstration purposes. Another important thing is to use a needle that is as similar as possible to the needle you're going to be using in your project. The size of the needle can change how you hold the needle and therefore change your gauge. And the material of the needle can also change how you knit. It can change your gauge as well. So knitting with something that is as close as possible to your final project needle is going to give you the best result. All right, so I have a little bit of garter stitch here. That's just to stabilize the edge. And I'm going to knit across my entire row. Now that I'm reaching the end of the row, I am going to even out my fabric, and then I'm just going to carry the yarn behind and back to the start of the project, and I'm going to leave a little bit of looseness behind there just so it doesn't distort the edges or anything like that and pull things too tight. So leaving a little bit of looseness is better than pulling it tight. And then I guess if I want to have garter stitch at the edge, I'm going to have to purl the first couple of stitches and then continue knitting across the row. And then again, knitting a little bit of, or I guess working a little bit of garter at the end. And again, once you reach the end, you just wrap that yarn behind and continue knitting. This technique is kind of like knitting a very long I-cord that you're just not pulling tight, and it allows you to get the effect of knitting every row without having a very, very large circumference to be able to measure your gauge over. And as you can see, these edge stitches are getting pretty loose. This is completely normal. You can tighten these up after you're done with your swatch and just kind of pull the edges, but you're not going to be measuring your gauge at the edges, which is why you're casting on at least 6 inches of stitches. So don't worry about this pulling, out and being a little bit messy. That is completely okay. It is not a problem at all. Just keep in mind it may look a little bit messy around the edge. You can even see on this swatch that I had shown you earlier, if you look at the edges are not super neat, but by the time you get into the center of the swatch, everything is nice and neat and even. So it's really not a problem that the edges are a little bit distorted. When you finish knitting your swatch, you'll have something that looks a little bit like this. Of course, your threads will still be intact here, but you'll have those threads going across each row all the way up your swatch. Your edges may curl in a bit. That's totally okay. The next step after completing your swatch is to block your swatch. You're going to have to wash your finished garment at some point, so you want to know what happens when you place your fabric into water. So after blocking, and blocking is just get it wet, soak it in the sink for a little bit, squeeze out the excess water gently, and once you do that, when your swatch is still damp, take a pair of scissors and just snip up the threads here in the center, and then you can pull the threads out and lay your swatch flat to dry. You can kind of pull the edges to even out those messier stitches at the side. They will still be uneven. That's completely okay, completely normal. Your goal is to have even fabric in the center of your work, and that is exactly why we cast on the 6 inches of stitches, so there's plenty of space at the sides for things to be wonky, for things to be going wrong, and still get an accurate gauge measurement in the center of your work. Thank you for coming by today to learn more about swatching and how to swatch flat in the round. This is the best swatching technique to use for any project that you're knitting in the round or that is mostly knit in the round. If you'd like to follow more of my work, you can like and subscribe. You can also find me on Instagram as Carrie Knits, or head over to my website at carrieknits.com.